In the May of 334 BC, during Alexander the Great's campaign against the Persian Empire, he scored his first major victory at the Battle of the Granicus, a conflict that occurred in northwest Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, close to the Granicus River. Positioned along the steep river banks, the Persian forces, commanded by local satraps and generals, presented a formidable challenge to the young general, owing to the difficult terrain. Crossing the river and charging straight at the Persian commanders was an act of bold leadership and tactical genius under pressure on the part of Alexander. The Macedonian cavalry and infantry were able to gain a foothold on the opposite bank, despite the difficult crossing and initial heavy resistance, thanks to the Persian battle line being disrupted by their aggressive approach. Eventually, the Persian line collapsed, and Alexander's forces swiftly gained the upper hand. Politically and militarily, the triumph was pivotal, as it cemented Alexander's position within his own army and deterred any potential alliances between Persian and Greek states in the future. With the victory, the stage was set for Alexander's rapid and extensive conquest of the region, now that the gates of Asia Minor had been flung open before him. Welcome to the channel, everyone. To the newcomers, nice to meet you. To those returning, good to see you again. Off we go on another adventure, this time all the way back into the time of Alexander the Great. Those who want to support the channel are already doing so. Just enjoy it. Have a laugh sometimes and learn something. Get nice and relaxed. Like and subscribe also helps the algorithm, and there's a few links in the description if you feel inclined. But, most importantly, let's all get ready for a long one again. Take a seat, or busy yourself with whatever you want to do. We're about to begin. Following the victory in Chaeronea in 338 BC, King Philip II of Macedon coerced the majority of the Greek states into joining what was known as the Hellenic League, a military alliance. You see, in 480 BC, the Persians had invaded Greece again, and this time they wanted revenge, so that they went to war with the Achaemenid Empire. He began making preparations for war after successfully persuading the other Greek states to elect him as the leader of the Hellenic League. Meanwhile, the Achaemenid Empire, also known as the Persian Empire, had been in shambles ever since King Artaxerxes III was assassinated in 338 BC. This led to Egypt's second succession from the empire, which was a major issue. No one wants to lose Egypt. It's a good one to have on your team, particularly because of all the crops that grow along the Nile River. You get a little bit hungry when Egypt leaves the party in ancient times. Well, there was no Persian army of any size in Asia Minor at the time, and no one even anticipated that the Persian fleet would soon be in the Aegean Sea. Philip probably intended to take advantage of the imperial anarchy, but his army was not prepared to invade Asia Minor on a massive scale, at least not just yet. And this is why he most likely dispatched a more manageable portion of the army, not fully committing. Well, he sent thousands of Macedonian soldiers on an expedition to the western coast of Asia Minor in the spring of 336 BC. This advance guard was probably sent out with orders to seize as much ground as possible, or, short of that, to lay the groundwork for a bridgehead across the Hellespont from Asia to help the main army cross later when it needed to. Now, in comes one of the main characters, Parmenion, Philip's finest general, was probably in charge of the advance guard, while Attalus serving as his deputy. At first, the campaign was fruitful. The Macedonians peacefully captured numerous Greek cities in Western Asia Minor, very little resistance, walking straight in. But suddenly, in the year 336, everything changed. It was in the October of that year that Philip was assassinated. Alexander III, who succeeded his father Philip, had to quell the multiple uprisings in Greece and the Balkans before he could restore Macedonian rule. Thus the operations in Asia Minor were diverted from his attention by this. At the same time, in the fall of 336 BC, Darius III succeeded to the title of Great King of the Achaemenid Empire. He restored order to the empire, and upon doing so, made plans for a retaliatory attack against the Macedonian expedition. This town is not big enough for the both of us. One can only imagine. Well, of course, deep-seated anxieties between the Persians and the Greeks, and, as extension, Macedonians too. Well, the Egyptian uprising, which occurred between the last days of 336 and the beginning of 335, was Darius's top priority, and until it was put down, nothing could really be done further north. After this, he dispatched Memnon of Rhodes to lead a group of Greek mercenaries, infantry fighting as hoplites, to Asia Minor. Memnon likely vanquished a Macedonian army in the early spring of 335 at Magnesia, or on the Meander, or ad Sipylum. In the same year, in the Troad, a Persian army, perhaps led by a satrap or a few different satraps, routed yet another Macedonian force. With the exception of Abydos and maybe Rhoetium, the expeditionary force lost control of the majority of Greek cities by the end of 335. In the early spring of 334, after quelling the uprisings in Greece and the Balkans, Alexander decided to march his army to the Hellespont. About 32,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry made up the force. 20 days later, he reached Sestus, withdrew his army, and prepared to cross the Hellespont. Alexander led the remaining infantrymen from Eleos across the sea to land near Carpe Sigium, where the bulk of the army was marched from Sestus to Abydos in Asia Minor. Arispa, Percote, Lampsacus, Colonae, and Hermotus were among the places he passed after Ilium. A tour of all of the great sites of Asia Minor at the time. One can only imagine being a soldier in Alexander's army, that excitement of going out to see the world, albeit with a little bit of naivety. I suppose when you're that young, you don't think of the risks. Well, if you're going to be in anyone's army, you may as well be in Alexander's. You have a pretty damn good chance of winning. Well, Darius, he would have known where Alexander was going, at least for a while, perhaps even before the invasion army departed from Macedon. You see, the great king of Persia was still unconcerned about it, though, and delegated the defense of Asia Minor to his satraps. After all, how far could one Macedonian general get? Well, the possible causes for this include Alexander's perceived lack of experience as an overseas commander, and the relatively easy retreat of the Macedonian expeditionary force the year before, who gave up without much of a fight. Hearing of Alexander's crossing, the Persian satraps and commanders assembled their armies, and camped near Zelea. Now, Hellespontine Phrygia's satrap Aristes is believed to be in overall command, because the enemy had invaded his territory, even though ancient historians don't specifically name a Persian commander-in-chief, so we're led to decide on the most likely scenario. Grains of salt, please. Now, at Zelea, the Persians convened a council to review the situation and decide on the best course of action. And here we do have our sources of the time, Arrian and Diodorus Siculus, who assert that Memnon counseled the Persians against engaging in open combat with the Macedonians. He deduced that the Macedonian infantry was more formidable than theirs, and that Alexander was physically present, but Darius was nowhere to be found. In order to prevent Alexander from continuing his campaign with proper supplies, he suggested a scorched earth strategy. Burn the farms, burn it all. The granaries too. We can't have the Macedonian soldiers looting and eating the food that is grown on our soil, can't we? Well, to safeguard their subjects' property, Arcides and the other Persians, remember that Arcides is the Hellespontine Phrygia's satrap and the commander. Arcides and the other Persians disregarded Memnon's advice. They weren't too keen to just burn everything down that quickly. In addition, they had perceived that Memnon was plotting to keep the war going, in hopes of making himself a golden boy in the eyes of Darius. There has been parallels drawn between the wise counsel offered by the Greeks to the Persians in Herodotus's work and Memnon's words of wisdom. According to Herodotus, the Persians were mocked because they suffered misfortune after rejecting such advice, and this is why it is implied that Arrian and Diodorus concocted Memnon's counsel. Although the debate may have transpired as depicted, some maintain that the significance of Memnon's advice was exaggerated, since the objective of gathering was not to discuss strategy. The council at Zelea probably did not discuss war strategy, but rather the tactics of the approaching battle, because Darius had probably already ordered his satraps to engage Alexander's army anyway. Regardless, following the council, the Persian forces positioned themselves on the eastern bank of the Granicus River, patiently awaiting the Macedonian assault. According to Arrian, Alexander received word from his scouts about the whereabouts of the Persians as he advanced towards the Granicus. He organized his army into battle formation. If the army could not cross the river with its extended front, Parmenion feared, it would have to cross in column, destroying its battle formation. He told Alexander that tenting on the western bank and making an uncontested crossing tomorrow at dawn would be better than leaving the army exposed to a Persian attack, but not wanting to waste any time, Alexander gave the order to launch the assault right away. This pattern of Parmenion and Alexander debating tactics and strategy appears again and again in the works of the ancient historians. Parmenion comes across as cautious in these exchanges, while Alexander is portrayed as more daring. Every time that the old general advises Alexander against doing something rash, Alexander seems to ignore him and just goes on to accomplish his own daring plan. Perhaps Callisthenes first used this motive in his writings to highlight Alexander's bravery. Well, either way, historians have therefore speculated that the conversation may have been an invention, kind of a play on the personalities. Makes for an interesting story, but it's not too far-fetched. You'll find less believable things in the works of the ancient historians, especially their estimates on numbers, that's for sure. Now, according to the Gregorian calendar, May was the month of Daisios in Macedonia when the battle took place, and some Macedonians expressed their unwillingness to fight prior to the battle, citing the religious tradition that forbade them from engaging in combat during the month of Nisan. This was resolved when Alexander proclaimed that this month should be counted as a second Artemision, and there was no taboo on warfare in that month, which came before Daisios. Well, today, the Granicus is known as the Biga River. It has long been believed to be the site where the battle occurred at a ford or even downstream on the Biga River, or perhaps above the river's confluence with the one that flows through Gumasque. The idea that the Biga River might have flowed eastward in its valley during the battle was put forward more recently by N.G. Hammond. But there is still modern-day evidence of an ancient riverbed there, and according to the ancient chroniclers, the Persians stationed their Greek mercenary infantry along a continuous ridge. Hammond has positioned the ford between the modern villages of Gumasque and Sesmelti due to the fact that the ridge has only one potential candidate. Scholarship that came after the battle corroborated this theory, although the ancient historians stressed the difficulty of fording the river, in contrast to contemporary accounts that the river is not that difficult to cross. But then again, anything's difficult to cross wearing all that armor. Of course, it is possible that the ancient historians embellished Alexander's achievements just a little bit to give the impression that they were more significant, which personally I don't think they really needed to. They were significant enough as it is, without any embellishment. Well, I suppose I wasn't there, so. Now, let's talk a little bit about the army of Macedon. Well, infantry units made up the bulk of it, of course. In fact, there were 12,000 heavy infantry, among whom were the foot companions and a smaller number of elite hypaspists. There were 1,000 light infantrymen too, including archers, and the best Agrianian javelin men. A total of 1,800 elite companion cavalry, 1,800 cavalry from Thessaly, and 600 cavalry from Greek allies made up the heavy equestrian contingent, and there were a total of 900 light cavalrymen, including Paeonians and Thracians. Though he had marched to the Granicus without them, Alexander likewise possessed Greek allied and mercenary infantry, just in case. Thus there was a grand total of about 18,100 men in Alexander's army, that once again being 12,000 heavy infantry, 1,000 light infantry, and 5,100 cavalry. Moving from right to left, Alexander assigned Philotas command of 7 of his 8 squadrons of companion cavalry, the archers and the Agrianians. The Agrianians were probably positioned in front of the companion cavalry, because they typically fought alongside them. Their flank was occupied by the Prodromoi, the Paeonian cavalry, and the 8th squadron of the companion cavalry, commanded by Socrates. Amintas, son of Archebeos, was in charge of these 3-horse units as a whole. They were followed by Nicanor's Hypaspists, who stood guard on the right flank of the foot companions adjacent to them. Perdiccas, Coenus, Craterus, Amintas, Philip, and Meleager were the 6 foot companions under the command of Andromenes' son. The Thracians' cavalry, led by Agathon, stood to Meleager's left of his foot companions. The Greek cavalry assigned to Philip, son of Menelaus, was stationed adjacent to them. On the far left, there was Callas's Thessalian cavalry, and Parmenion was assigned the general command of Philip and Meleager's foot companions, as well as the cavalry on the left flank. On the right side of the army, Alexander had the remaining troops under his command. But the battle action did not involve the mercenary infantry or Greek allied infantry that had been part of the invasion force. They stayed behind, at least for now. Now, what about the Persian side? Well, we know about that from Arrian, who provides a total of 20,000 cavalry and 20,000 infantrymen, all of whom were paid off Greek mercenaries. You can imagine that they weren't going to fight too hard for the Persians, but money talks. Well, according to Diodorus, we have a little bit of a different account. Remember how I said those ancient sources can blow things out of proportion a little bit? Well, Diodorus claims there was 10,000 cavalry and 100,000 foot soldiers. And if you thought that that was a little out of proportion, another historian, Justin, provides an even more impressive figure of 600,000 in total. Of course, the modern historian Azargat says that the Greek accounts greatly exaggerated the size of the Persian Empire's armies. But the empire and the armies were still huge. Well, since they were biased towards nationalism and lacked accurate information, pre-modern writers did this quite a lot, and according to Gut, it is an invariable habit. Well, if you've read through Herodotus, I'm sure you know about that. Well, according to Arrian, N.G.L. Hammond accepts the number of Persian troops. The figures provided by Justin and Diodorus are pretty much considered fictitious. due to the logistical impossibility of fielding such an army. Most historians agree that Diodorus's estimate of 10,000 cavalry is the more credible one. The claim made by Arrian regarding the number and makeup of the Persian infantry has prompted a more in-depth examination, and there are differing opinions on whether the number of 20,000 is indeed correct, especially considering that it encompasses native infantry, who are not even Greek. Well, some have hypothesized that the sparse number of Greek mercenaries may have been the sole infantrymen on the scene. Although Arrian's assertion of 20,000 infantrymen is credible, one modern historian, Christoph Nowotka, does not believe that they were all Greek mercenaries. It would have been extremely rare for the great king of Persia to summon such a huge army without extensive planning and supervision. So, according to his assessment, only a small percentage of the infantry would have consisted of Greek mercenaries, since the Achaemenids had neglected to make such preparations for the battle. So, most of the infantry were small, local units that weren't really all that useful in terms of grand strategy. And there are people who agree with this assessment. In fact, Ernst Badian agrees with Plutarch that non-Greek infantry was part of the Persian army and stationed directly behind the cavalry. He bases this on the fact that both sides' infantry engaged after the Macedonian phalanx crossed the river. The total number of infantrymen, in his opinion, should be around 20,000. Well, according to another modern observer, A.M. Devine, Arrian probably inflated the number of Greek mercenaries for purely propaganda reasons. Besides Diodorus and Polyaenus, he says, no one else writes about Greek mercenaries in Asia Minor during that time. According to Diodorus, there were 5,000 men in Memnon's Greek mercenary group that Darius dispatched to Asia Minor to engage the Macedonian expeditionary force. Polyaenus lists 4,000 as a lesser figure. If the estimate of Diodorus of 10,000 cavalry is credible, and Arrian's assertion that the infantry was composed entirely of Greek mercenaries is indeed correct, then the Persian army probably had about 14 to 15,000 men. Comparatively, Alexander fielded 18,100, which was a vast improvement in both quantity and quality. Now, once again, according to A.M. Devine, the Persians' decision to deploy their cavalry in the forefront and defend a river crossing is a reflection of their inferior force. The rationale behind Alexander's decision to launch a frontal assault there would also be clarified. Similarly, if there had been 20,000 Greek mercenaries instead of 4,000 or 5,000, the subsequent encirclement and slaughter of these men would have been highly improbable. Last, but not least, the small number of casualties for the Macedonians would be consistent with the low estimate for the size of the Persian army. So, was it really that great victory against the overwhelming odds? It doesn't seem so. But hey, it's still a victory. Anyway, along the Granicus banks, the Persians posted their cavalry, with their respective cavalry units, Memnon and Arsames holding the left wing. Arsaces led the Paphlagonian horsemen who were stationed next to them. He was accompanied by Siphratates, who commanded the Hyrcanian horsemen. Cavalry of unknown ethnicity held the center, and 1,000 Median cavalry, 2,000 of them under Rheomithre's command, and 2,000 Bactrian horse made up the right wing. When the Persians saw that Alexander was stationed opposite their left wing, they sent some cavalry to reinforce it. Behind the cavalry, under the command of the Persian Omares, were stationed more Greek mercenaries. Many of the Persian commanders' decisions have come under fire from historians. One of these is the cavalry's deployment on the riverbank, which prevented them from charging. The absence of charge tactics by the Persian cavalry during that era explains this. From a distance they would instead approach the enemy formations, launch javelin attacks to disrupt and demoralize. The cavalry would transition to curved swords for close-quarter combat once the formation had become sufficiently disorganized. Historians have also pondered the question of why exactly, after his successes in leading the Greek mercenaries, Memnon was assigned command of a cavalry unit on the front line. The Persian commander's distrust and envy of him could have been a driving factor. Well, being right there on the front line would have made Memnon much easier to command after all. The third grievance from the modern observers is that their infantry are being sent far from the front lines. The Persian commanders may have been motivated by animosity towards the Greek mercenaries who had vanquished the Macedonians at Magnesia the previous years. They could have restored their honor by vanquishing Alexander using only their cavalry. Well, Arrian, Plutarch, and Diodorus are the three ancient historians who presented conflicting versions of the account. Though shorter, Plutarch's narrative is most consistent with Arrian's narrative, with a few minor exceptions. Arrian's account is the longest and most detailed. In contrast to Arrian and Plutarch's accounts, Diodorus Siculus presents a very different picture. Arrian, first, claims that a moment of quiet was observed after the two armies had completed their deployment. Following this, Alexander gave the order for Amyntas, the son of Arrhabaeus, to launch an attack on the Persian left flank. The formation should have consisted of the following: the Paeonian cavalry, the prodromoi, an infantry unit whose composition is a little unclear, and the companion cavalry squadron of Socrates, which is now being led by Ptolemy, the son of Philip. Arrian later clarifies that Alexander's assault followed the retreat of Amyntas's forces, but initially gives the idea that he advanced simultaneously with the rest of the right wing and the infantry. It's possible that Arrian's source did this to give Alexander a more heroic appearance. Volleys of javelins were fired by the Persians in response to the advance of the vanguard. The Persians were defending the higher ground at the top of the bank, and Amyntas's force was greatly outnumbered. The Macedonians were overrun and forced to retreat towards Alexander, who launched an assault with the remnants of the right wing's companion cavalry. The failure of Amyntas's attack, according to A.M. Devine, was not accidental, but rather a trap to force the Persian cavalry to break formation and pursue Amyntas's retreat into the riverbed. If the Persian formation had been disrupted, Alexander himself could have launched a second attack on them. Various versions and readings of Arrian's account of Alexander's cavalry attack have been proposed. Well, the Persian center has been interpreted by some historians as the target of Arrian's description. According to J.F. Fuller, Alexander led his attack diagonally to the left in order to attack the Persian center from that side. Similarly, according to A.B. Bosworth, this migration was headed leftward towards the Persian center downstream. As they ascended to the eastern bank of the Granicus, the Macedonian forces would have formed up in a wedge formation after initially moving in a diagonal line, which takes quite a lot of coordination, credit where it's due, and adrenaline notwithstanding. Now, according to some, Alexander actually launched an assault on the Persian left flank, and Arrian makes it very evident, according to Ernest Badian, that the Persians had gathered their cavalry on the left flank, and it was precisely this formation that Alexander attacked. As a result, Alexander would have had to have gone in a fairly straight line. It seems he would have stepped onto the riverbed at a very narrow point, leaving his cavalry in a column that would be attacked from the flanks as they climbed the Persian side of the river bank at a wider point. While remaining on the riverbed, Alexander could have avoided this by leading his men to the left, against the flow of the water. He could have made his formation more visible to the Persians as they emerged from the opposite bank if he had have done this. According to N.G. Hammond, the troops were ordered to stay in line as they crossed the Granicus, so they moved upstream to the right, and this would have allowed Alexander's cavalry to largely mimic the Persian cavalry's formation, while avoiding disorderly and column crossings. It was an oblique formation, not just an oblique movement. Well, Alexander and his army fought a fierce battle against the Persians and their commanders, according to Arrian's account. The Macedonians were able to gain the upper hand due to the superior melee effectiveness of their lance, the ziston, compared to the Persian javelin. Alexander himself requested a new lance from his servants Aretis after it broke during the combat. Thus Alexander received Demaratus of Corinth's lance, since Aretis had also broken his in combat. Mithridates, Darius' son-in-law, was subsequently observed by Alexander directing a cavalry unit. After charging at him, Alexander slashed him in the throat with the lance. The helmet then shielded Alexander from another Persian nobleman, Rosakes, who struck him with a sword. With a swift thrust to the chest, Alexander vanquished him in turn with the lance. As Mithridates prepared to sneak up on Alexander from behind, Cleitus the Black severed his sword arm, and by this point Alexander's force had been reinforced by the other Macedonian cavalry who had taken up positions on the banks. By this stage of the fight, the Persian cavalry had been driven back by the Macedonian cavalry and light infantry that were scattered among them. It was all starting on Alexander's left flank, according to Arrian, where the Persians were fighting the hardest. Afterwards, the Persian cavalry on either flank fled as the center was breached. After a brief pursuit, Alexander shifted his focus to the Greek mercenaries, who had mostly done, well, pretty much nothing since arriving. The mercenaries were caught off guard by the sudden change of events, and were pursued by the foot companions in the lead and the cavalry in every other direction. Shortly after they were routed, and only a handful managed to flee. Well, that is the account of Arrian. But what about Plutarch? What did he have to say about it? Well, the movements and strategies of the armies receive rather less attention in Plutarch's accounts. It's just not as detailed. It's primarily devoted to the aristeia of Alexander's personal combat with the Persian leaders. But there are some discrepancies. But generally speaking, the story lines up with Arrian's account, unless we really go into technicalities. But the Persians had infantry and cavalry stationed at the front line, according to Plutarch, just as it was in Arrian's writing. While Alexander's battles with Rosaces and Sphithridates were similar, Alexander spearheaded the initial assault on the Persians himself. Crossing the river, the foot companions engaged the Persian infantry as the cavalry battle raged on. Everyone was vanquished after a brief skirmish, with the exception of the Greek mercenaries. They withdrew to a more advantageous vantage point. Alexander was asked to negotiate their surrender, but he declined and chose to attack instead. Most of the Macedonian casualties were caused by the mercenaries' fierce fighting. Well, in terms of Diodorus' account, the armies of Macedon and Persia camped on opposite sides of the Granicus and remained stationary for the remainder of the day. The following day, at first light, Alexander crossed the Granicus without any resistance. After that, the cavalry of both armies charged into the battle. Then, in a slightly different account from Arrian and Plutarch, Diodorus details Alexander's personal combat with the Persian nobles. Following the deaths of numerous Persian commanders and widespread retreats of Persian cavalry, Alexander's opponents were ultimately defeated. As they took flight, the remaining Persian cavalrymen followed suit, and after this, the infantry began fighting, and the Persian infantry quickly lost the battle. Well, in terms of the modern perceptions, Alexander of Macedon, written by historian Peter Green in 1974, offered a solution to the conflict between Diodorus and Arrian's narratives, a middle ground of some sort. Well, Green argues that the river bank was defended by infantry rather than cavalry, and that Alexander's army was obliged to retreat after suffering heavy casualties in their first foray across the river. After reluctantly listening to Parmenion's advice, Alexander forded the river at night in an undefended spot, and on the following day fought the battle. The Persian cavalry arrived at the site of the battle ahead of the slower infantry, and the fighting continued in a fashion similar to that described by Arrian and Plutarch, as the army rushed to the spot of Alexander's crossing. To explain the discrepancy between his story and the ancient records, Green suggests that Alexander later attempted to hide the fact that his crossing had failed. According to Green, Alexander would not be able to accept even a temporary loss due to political considerations. The 2013 reprints preface included Green's admission that he no longer found his theory compelling, and that the inexplicable contradiction still perplexed him. While a number of other historians have sided with Arrian and Plutarch and outright rejected Diodorus' story as false. You see, the Macedonians were known for their seamless coordination of infantry and cavalry, so Diodorus's depiction of a distinct conflict between the two types of troops would have been highly unusual. The Persians probably would have noticed and fought against a Granicus crossing at night or dawn. I mean, it's kind of hard to miss, don't you think? It could have caused the Persian army to withdraw, even if there was another, less obstructed crossing available. That would have meant that Alexander missed out on the chance to swiftly wipe out the lone Persian army stationed in Asia Minor at the time. Even more so than if the Macedonians had have attacked at dawn. The Persians would have fought with the sun in their eyes if they had attacked in the afternoon, and we know they wouldn't have done that, because none of them brought their sunglasses. Now, what about the casualties? Let's get back to being serious for a moment. Arrian reports 115 casualties for the Macedonians. Now, this breaks down to 25 companion cavalry, 60 normal cavalry, and 30 infantry, all of whom were killed in the preliminary attack. The casualties recorded by Plutarch were 34, with 25 being cavalry and 9 infantry. Out of the 120 cavalry killed, 9 were actually infantry according to Justin's account. Now, according to A.M. Divine, the first person cited by Arrian regarding the number of casualties was Ptolemy I, and Ptolemy I was citing Callisthenes. Aristobulus was the source that Plutarch drew from. Since Plutarch's 25 dead are likely the 25 companions that died during the preliminary attack, it appears that he has misinterpreted the information. No one's perfect. Justin's depictions appear to be a muddled-up hybrid of Aristobulus and Ptolemy I. Due to the brief nature of the conflict, A.M. Divine finds Arrian's calculations to be quite plausible. That figure I just cited of 115. What about the Persian army? Well, according to the Macedonians, they lost 1,000,000 bajillion gajillion men. No, I'm just joking. Well, countless Persian chieftains met the same fate as the nobles who fought side by side with Alexander. Among the individuals mentioned by Arrian are Niphates, Petenes, Arbupales, who was Darius's brother and Artaxerxes II's son, Pharnaces, Darius's wife's brother, and Omares. After escaping to Phrygia, Arsaces took his life due to the guilt he felt over the loss. Artaxerxes, the satrap of Greater Phrygia, is mentioned as killed by Diodorus. However, he is later mentioned as a casualty at the Battle of Issus. 1,000 Persian cavalrymen were killed and 2,000 Greek mercenaries captured, according to Arrian. Plutarch records a death toll of 2,500 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers. 2,000 cavalry and 10,000 infantry were killed, according to Diodorus, and 20,000 men were captured. Well, modern historians such as A.M. Divine finds the death tolls reported by Plutarch and Diodorus, of course, to be absurdly high. He thinks that Arrian's estimates of 2,000 captured Greek mercenaries and 1,000 killed cavalry to be about right. He uses Arrian's number on the mercenaries who were captured to suggest that the other 18,000 were killed, a claim he denies. His assumption that the number of Greek mercenaries was no more than 4,000 to 5,000 suggest that between 2,000 and 3,000 of them may have perished in the slaughter. The sum of these losses amounts to anywhere between 5,000 to 6,000 Persians. Well, what about the aftermath? Well, Macedon received the 2,000 captured Greek mercenaries, and they sent them there to serve as slave laborers. Alexander considered them to have betrayed their fellow Greeks by selling themselves out to the Persians. A fair assessment. Well, this was in direct violation, however, of the Hellenic League Pact, which had mandated that the Greeks fight Persia and not each other. In addition, he sent 300 sets of Persian armor to the Acropolis in Athens as a sacrifice to Athena, and I'm sure Athena was very pleased to receive it. Alexander, son of Philip and all the Greeks, except the Lacedaemonians, presenting this offering from the spoils taken from the barbarians inhabiting Asia. He had an inscription fixed over them to mark the absence from his united Greek army. Alexander the Great had a group of statues called the Granicus Monument erected in the Dion Temple of Zeus. Bronze sculptures by Lysippus depicted Alexander riding a horse alongside 25 of his comrades who had perished in the first cavalry charge. And after the Fourth Macedonian War in 146 BC, Quintus Caecilius Metellus Macedonius brought this group of statues to Rome and placed them in a portico he constructed beneath the Capitoline Hill. But what about Parmenion? Well, he took control of Dascylium after the Persian garrisons evacuated. Sardis capitulated to Alexander as he marched toward it, and after continuing to Ephesus, he found that its garrison of Greek mercenaries had also evacuated the city. After receiving surrender offers from Magnesia and Tralles, he dispatched Parmenion to those cities. He had Lysimachus restore democracy and dismantle the oligarchies in the city of Aeolis and Ionia that were still under Persian rules, and Miletus fought back when Alexander arrived, so that the city was placed under siege. But what about the Persians? Well, a sizable section of them were actually able to escape, and they fled to Halicarnassus. The casualties on the way were not catastrophic, but of course they had to leave all of the dead behind. But the Achaemenid Empire faced a strategically dangerous conclusion. You see, it was the first time that the citadel of Sardis had fallen, and that an enemy could continue its march without significant obstacles all the way to Halicarnassus. Achaemenid satraps had been vanquished in Asia Minor, and Sardis had been besieged before. So, the Persians now, looking north and contemplating a retreat east, viewed those dark clouds rolling in, and it seemed there was nothing they could do about it. See you at Gaugamela. I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons: Britt, Charles, Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, Wendy, Tim, James, Erin, Scott, Dark, Ben, and Melissa. Thank you very much. I hope you had fun. I'm going to see you back here tomorrow, right here on YouTube, for more of the old history. It never gets old. Knowledge is timeless. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all. I mean it dearly. See you tomorrow.